The sun had barely risen, and yet the heat had already begun to press against the windows, making the air feel heavy and motionless. It was one of those summer days where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, where every sound felt muffled, subdued under the weight of the season. I had grown used to the quiet, to the rhythm of a life without interruptions. The house, modest and sun-drenched, was my sanctuary, a place where each room held a familiar silence, and each moment passed without demand or expectation. That morning, everything felt unchanged. I moved through the kitchen preparing coffee with the same automatic gestures I performed every day. The floor creaked in the usual places. The smell of brewing coffee filled the air, warm and grounding. I had no reason to anticipate that anything would be different, and perhaps that's what made the disruption feel even more profound. The call had come the day before, brief, casual, but its impact was lingering. My half-brother's voice had been matter-of-fact, as if asking me to water his plants instead of watch over his teenage son. A work trip, sudden and unavoidable. Just a couple of weeks, he'd said. Just until things settled. I hadn't seen the boy, my step-nephew, for years. The last time was at a family event I barely remembered, where he had remained mostly in the background, a quiet, observant presence. I agreed out of habit, out of family obligation, out of something unspoken that still tethered me to people I no longer saw. I told myself it was nothing. A simple favor. But the truth is, even before he arrived, I felt the first subtle tremor of change, like a shift in the foundation of a house you've lived in for too long. He came just after noon, when the sun was at its peak and the shadows outside had shrunk to thin, trembling outlines. I watched from the front window as a rideshare car pulled up. He stepped out slowly, wearing a black t-shirt, faded jeans, and a cap pulled low over his brow. He looked older than I remembered, taller, leaner, with a quiet, guarded energy that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He slung a single duffel bag over one shoulder and stood still for a moment, taking in the house with a detached sort of interest. Opening the door to let him in felt strange, like allowing something unfamiliar to enter a space I'd worked hard to preserve. As he stepped inside, the temperature seemed to shift, not cooler, not warmer, but different. The air itself felt altered. I led him up to the guest room, which I had prepared earlier that morning with a kind of nervous efficiency. I changed the sheets, wiped down the furniture, aired out the musty corners that hadn't seen movement in months. It was clean, organized, almost sterile, a room designed for temporary occupancy. He didn't say much as he walked in. Just dropped his bag beside the bed and glanced around slowly, as if cataloging the room's contents for future reference. I left him there and returned downstairs, but the silence I came back to wasn't the same as the one I'd left. It no longer belonged solely to me. It had been subtly rewritten, adjusted to accommodate an unfamiliar presence. I tried to resume my routine, sat in my usual spot on the couch, picked up a book I wasn't really interested in, sipped my coffee even though it had gone cold, but my focus kept slipping. I became hyper-aware of the faint noises from upstairs, the soft thump of footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the zip of a suitcase opening. Even those ordinary sounds seemed to carry weight, as if each one was announcing, someone else is here. Later, I heard him move to the bathroom, the soft knock of cabinet doors closing. Nothing invasive. Nothing out of place. But I was no longer alone, and the realization settled over me like a layer of humidity I couldn't brush away. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was something subtler, a disruption of my solitude, a reminder that the house was no longer an extension of just myself. In the late afternoon, I sat by the window and watched as the light slanted across the hardwood floors. Dust floated in the sunbeams like suspended time. I heard him descend the stairs quietly, almost cautiously, and step into the kitchen. I didn't turn my head immediately. I listened to the faint clink of glass, the hollow glug of water being poured, the tap of fingers against the countertop. He moved with a strange grace, measured, controlled, as though always aware of how much space he occupied. He reminded me of someone used to being overlooked, and because of that, acutely aware of everything around him. He lingered in the kitchen for a few minutes before retreating back upstairs. I remained on the couch, unmoving, the book still open but unread in my lap. The quiet in the house now felt layered. There was my own silence, cultivated and familiar, and then there was his, a new, tentative silence that seemed to stretch out from the walls themselves. That night, when the sky turned violet and the air grew heavier with stillness, I stood on the back porch, listening to the crickets stir. The stars blinked faintly above the silhouetted trees, and I exhaled into the heat, unsure of what I was feeling. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement. It was the awareness of a shift, like standing at the edge of a new current and feeling it tug at your ankles. He was just a guest, I reminded myself. Family. Temporary. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The moment he crossed the threshold, something unspoken had entered with him. Something quiet. Something that didn't yet have a name. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan turned slowly above me, slicing through the thick air in steady, monotonous beats. The house groaned with familiar sounds, but each creak and whisper now felt amplified. Somewhere upstairs, he too was awake. I could sense it in the rhythm of the floor, in the occasional soft shift of weight above my head. It wasn't fear that kept me from sleeping. It was the realization that the solitude I had built around myself, brick by silent brick, had been undone in a single day. And though he had said almost nothing, though he had done nothing out of the ordinary, the very fact of his presence had begun to unspool something I hadn't even known I was protecting. As the night deepened, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts turning slowly like the blades above me. A guest, I told myself again. Nothing more. But the house had changed. And so had I. The days began to take on a quiet rhythm. Not quite routine, but something close to it. Each morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool enough to feel forgiving. I moved through the house with care, as if not to disturb the invisible shift that had occurred. The creaks in the floor, the rustle of blinds, the drip of coffee into the pot, all of it was familiar, and yet it felt different, subtly altered by the presence of someone else. He would come downstairs about an hour later, usually barefoot, dressed in loose clothes that made him seem even younger than he was. His hair was always slightly messy, like he had just rolled out of bed and hadn't bothered to fix it. He made his own breakfast, never asking, never imposing. It was a kind of self-sufficiency that I found strangely disarming. I began to notice things, not consciously at first, but gradually, as if my mind had started to collect details without asking my permission. The way he stood by the kitchen window, motionless, staring out as he sipped orange juice directly from the bottle. The way he drummed his fingers absently against the countertop when he was lost in thought. The faint sound of music playing from his phone in the other room, low, ambient, always reflective. There was something about his presence that filled space without crowding it. He didn't demand attention, but he received it all the same. Our interactions were brief and functional. A nod in the hallway. A momentary crossing of paths. But beneath the surface of those small encounters was a growing awareness, a tension that didn't feel dangerous, but did feel undeniable. I found myself adjusting to him in ways I couldn't articulate. I began to listen for his footsteps, not because I was concerned, but because it brought a strange comfort. I started to measure my own movements against his, noticing how we shared the same spaces without speaking, how we became like shadows orbiting each other. He often retreated to the backyard in the late afternoons, stretching out on one of the old lawn chairs I hadn't used in years. He'd wear his headphones, a book sometimes resting on his stomach, eyes closed against the sun. I watched him from the window more than I cared to admit. Not out of suspicion or concern, but because there was something magnetic in his stillness. A kind of quiet he carried that mirrored the silence I had once claimed for myself. It was strange to see it reflected in someone else. I began to take note of his habits. How he always placed his phone screen down on the table, as if to block out the world. How he refolded towels after using them, always with the same crisp edge. How he avoided making eye contact for more than a few seconds, but when he did, it lingered just a fraction longer than it should have. These were small things, almost imperceptible, but they stacked up like bricks in a wall I hadn't meant to build. I didn't know what I was constructing: curiosity, connection, confusion, but it was becoming more solid each day. One evening, I passed by his room while he was on a video call. The door was slightly ajar, and I caught a glimpse of him laughing at something on the screen. It was a full, open expression I hadn't seen before, unguarded and effortless. For a moment, I froze there in the hallway, invisible but watching. It felt intrusive, wrong even, but I couldn't look away. That laugh stayed with me long after I returned to my room. It echoed in my mind during the quiet moments, during the long, heavy stretches of silence that followed. Later that night, I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a glass, staring out into the dark yard. The porch light buzzed faintly, casting a pale halo over the steps. Somewhere behind me, I heard him move, just the faint creak of the floorboards as he passed by, his presence barely touching mine. But it was enough. My skin tightened in response. My thoughts paused. I waited for something more, a word, a gesture, but none came. He was gone, and the silence returned. It became harder to focus on my own tasks. My writing stalled, emails remained unanswered, books lay open but unread. I'd sit in my study, pretending to work, but my thoughts always drifted. I began to wonder what he was thinking. If he noticed the change, if he felt the quiet weight that had settled between us. I told myself it was just the novelty of cohabitation, the awkward dance of two people adapting to a shared space. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. It wasn't just adjustment. It was something else entirely. I started watching how he moved. How he stretched in the mornings, arms raised over his head, shirt lifting slightly to reveal a sliver of skin. How he leaned against the doorframe, ankles crossed, gaze distant. How he fiddled with the edge of his shirt when he was uncomfortable, fingers tugging lightly at the seam. These were not things I sought out. They came to me uninvited, each one leaving a small impression I couldn't erase. I began to catalog them, unintentionally, like lines of poetry I hadn't meant to memorize. There was a moment one afternoon when I found him asleep on the couch. The light poured in through the window, bathing him in soft gold. His hand rested on his chest, rising and falling with each breath. His lips were slightly parted, his brow smooth and relaxed. He looked young, peaceful, untouched by the layers of observation I had wrapped around him. I stood there for a long time, just watching, my own breath shallow. I don't know what I was waiting for. Perhaps confirmation. Perhaps a sign that I wasn't reading too much into the silences. But all I found was stillness. And yet, it spoke volumes. I left the room quietly, my heart beating harder than I liked. I told myself it was just a reaction to the intimacy of the moment. The vulnerability of seeing someone in such a state. But the truth hovered close, whispering truths I wasn't ready to accept. The space between us was no longer neutral. It had changed. Or maybe I had. And the more I noticed him, the harder it became to pretend I didn't. Each detail added up. Each moment layered itself onto the last. And though nothing had happened, not really, the awareness grew like a second heartbeat. Steady. Inescapable. Echoing in every corner of the house. It began like any other day. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the air already thick with heat by the time I stepped into the kitchen. The usual hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the smell of coffee drifting upward, all the familiar rituals unfolded as they always did. I tried to ground myself in them, to find solace in the repetition, but something inside me felt off balance. Not because of anything he had said or done. In fact, he hadn't said much at all since he arrived. But his presence had begun to take up space inside me, not just around me. And that morning, I realized I was waiting. Not for a package, not for a call, not for an event. I was waiting for him to appear. When he finally came downstairs, it was nearly noon. He moved slowly, still half sleeping, his t-shirt clinging loosely to his frame, hair a mess of soft curls that looked untouched by a comb. He rubbed his eyes and moved toward the kitchen with a kind of casual indifference, reaching for a glass. I watched from the corner of the room, pretending to read an article on my tablet, but my eyes kept drifting. Every motion he made seemed louder than it should have been, each clink of glass, each step across the tile. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't attribute to the weather alone. Something between us had begun to stretch, to strain, and it was becoming harder to ignore. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened. A storm had been looming since morning, thick clouds creeping in like ink stains across the horizon. The wind picked up without warning, rattling the windows, tossing branches outside like toys. I stood by the back door, watching the trees sway under the pressure. A sharp crack of thunder followed, and then, just as suddenly, the power went out. The house fell into silence, interrupted only by the distant sound of rain slapping the roof. I didn't panic. The outage was brief, expected. I moved through the house, gathering candles, lighting them one by one. The soft glow they cast was uneven, flickering against the walls, filling the space with shadows. The air inside was warm and still, the lack of circulation making it feel almost stifling. I sat down in the living room, the only source of light coming from the candles on the coffee table. The room felt smaller, more intimate, the absence of electricity stripping away a layer of separation. He entered the room quietly, barefoot, carrying his phone like a talisman. The screen was dark. No signal. No charge. He dropped it beside him and sat at the far end of the couch, the space between us occupied by silence and candlelight. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The moment didn't require noise. It was already full of things unsaid. The atmosphere was tense in a way that didn't feel dangerous but undeniably alive. The shadows on his face shifted with the movement of the flame, giving his expression a fluidity I couldn't quite read. He leaned back, legs stretched out, his head resting lightly against the cushion. My eyes were drawn to the curve of his collarbone, the way his fingers moved across his thigh in absent patterns. I told myself to look away, to focus on anything else, but my body had stopped listening to reason. I was no longer detached. I was present. Fully. Painfully. I stood up, needing to move, to release some of the pressure building beneath my skin. I walked toward the window to check if the entire neighborhood had gone dark. The storm outside had eased, though the sky remained a bruised gray. I reached for the curtain, and as I passed him, I felt it, the back of his hand brushed against my forearm. Light. Barely a touch. But deliberate. It was the smallest of contacts, so subtle it could have been nothing. But it wasn't. The heat from his skin lingered, blooming like a spark across my arm. I froze mid-step, just long enough to register the shift. My breath caught, shallow and immediate. I didn't turn around. I didn't acknowledge it. But everything inside me contracted. The moment hung in the air like smoke, thin, persistent, impossible to grasp. When I sat back down, the distance between us remained the same, but the space felt charged, rewritten by what had happened. He didn't look at me. Didn't move. But I knew he felt it too. It was in the way he exhaled, slow and controlled, in the way his fingers flexed slightly against his leg. The silence between us grew heavier, more complex. And though nothing else happened, nothing further was said or done, I knew the moment had split something open. For the rest of the evening, we existed like two magnets, close but not touching, orbiting a tension that neither of us had the courage, or the language, to confront. I tried to distract myself, stared at the flame of the candle until my eyes blurred, counted the flickers like a metronome. But beneath the surface, my thoughts raced in loops. Why hadn't I moved? Why hadn't I said something, anything, to diffuse it? The answer, clear and sharp, cut through me like glass, because I hadn't wanted to. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay on top of the sheets, the heat pressing down on my skin, my body restless. I replayed the touch over and over again, dissecting it, analyzing it, searching for meaning. But no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind, I kept returning to the same feeling, that it wasn't a mistake. That it wasn't confusion. That something had been spoken in that single moment of contact, something neither of us dared put into words. I tried to tell myself it was a blip, an accident. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I had seen the way he looked at me afterward, quick and quiet, but with a glint of something that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe. Or acknowledgement. The beginning of something neither of us could take back. By the time dawn began to push faint light through the blinds, I was still awake, still tangled in sheets that felt too warm, too tight. My skin still remembered the brief brush of his hand. My mind, exhausted and raw, refused to let it go. I stared at the ceiling, watching the blades of the fan stand still, and I knew that something had cracked inside me. It wasn't love. Not yet. It wasn't lust, not fully. It was the beginning of a descent, a slow, spiraling collapse of distance and restraint. And I had taken the first step without even realizing it. Or maybe I had. Maybe I had just been waiting for an excuse. Either way, there was no turning back. Not anymore. The line had been crossed. Not in body, but in silence. And that, I knew, was more powerful than any touch. The next morning unfolded with the same measured pace as always, but nothing felt normal. The sun rose behind a veil of thin clouds, casting a grayish light through the windows. The rooms looked the same, the furniture unmoved, the dust motes still floating in the air as they had before, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a weight to it, a slow-burning tension humming beneath every surface. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow, careful not to make too much noise, careful not to acknowledge the shift I felt with every breath. He didn't appear for a while. The house remained still. I drank my coffee slowly, watching the front yard through the blinds, the same way I used to before he arrived. Only now, the view felt hollow, like something had been removed. I tried to focus on the mundane, washing dishes that weren't dirty, reorganizing a drawer I hadn't opened in months. But my thoughts wandered relentlessly, pulled toward the memory of the day before, the way his hand brushed my arm, the heat that bloomed beneath my skin, the silence that had followed and refused to leave. When he finally came downstairs, his movements were subdued, careful. He wore the same loose-fitting clothes he always did, his hair still damp from the shower. He crossed the room without looking at me, poured himself water, leaned against the counter with the casual grace I had started to recognize as his default. I watched him from the corner of my eye, pretending to be occupied with my phone, though I couldn't read a single word on the screen. The air between us was full, not of words or action, but of something unspoken that made every second stretch longer than it should. We existed in a kind of parallel, occupying the same spaces but avoiding any real contact. Our paths crossed in the hallway, in the kitchen, on the back porch, but they never collided. We moved like dancers in a slow, uncertain routine, always aware of where the other was, always choosing to look away a second too soon or too late. It wasn't awkwardness. It wasn't fear. It was restraint, and it was exhausting. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of his presence, even when I couldn't see him. I could tell when he was nearby by the way the floor creaked, by the faint shuffle of his footsteps, by the lingering scent of his shampoo in the upstairs hallway. I started to anticipate the sound of him moving from one room to another, the soft click of his door closing behind him, the murmur of music playing low enough that I could only feel its rhythm, not hear its melody. He was always there, just out of reach, just far enough to stay undefined. At night, the silence grew heavier. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the fan above me still unmoving. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was dense, like fog that had settled into the corners of the house, into the folds of the sheets, into the spaces behind my eyes. I could feel him across the hallway, separated by a wall and a closed door, and yet closer than I wanted to admit. I thought about the way he looked when he was asleep on the couch, the way his shirt sometimes clung to his back when he came inside from the heat, the way his fingers tapped against the table when he was deep in thought. I began to avoid him without making it obvious. I left the room just before he entered. I took longer showers when I heard him coming downstairs. I sat on the porch only after he had gone back inside. I told myself I needed space, that the moment between us had meant nothing, that the touch had been accidental. But my body remembered. My thoughts refused to let it go. And in the silence, those memories grew louder. Still, he never pushed. He never crossed the line again. But he didn't retreat either. He existed in that middle space, where everything felt like it was waiting to become something or to dissolve. And I stayed there with him, unsure of which I feared more. The distance between us became a container for all the things we wouldn't say. Every gesture, every pause, every glance was a substitute for language, a placeholder for desire unspoken and questions unanswered. I tried to convince myself it was manageable, that if I just maintained control, everything would pass. I told myself that the silence would stretch and fade, that the tension would dull with time. But the truth was, I was no longer in control. I was responding, reacting, adjusting myself to him in ways I didn't understand. I noticed when he was barefoot. I noticed when his voice dropped lower in the late evening. I noticed the scar on his forearm he tried to hide with long sleeves. I noticed everything, and I hated how much it mattered. One afternoon, I watched him through the window as he sat on the steps out back, head tilted to the sky, shirt pulled tight across his shoulders. His stillness felt deliberate, like he knew I was watching, like he was offering a silhouette without turning around. I stayed there longer than I should have, my hand resting on the edge of the sink, the faucet still running, water forgotten. I didn't move until he finally did, rising slowly, stretching his arms, disappearing back into the house. I realized then that I was waiting for something to change, but I didn't know what. A word. A confrontation. A confirmation. Anything that would break the stalemate. But the silence persisted, and the distance remained. It wasn't physical. It was emotional, mental, something deeper than I had words for. It was a slow, burning space between us, growing smaller every day, even as we tried to hold it in place. And through it all, I kept pretending. Pretending that it was nothing. Pretending that the ache in my chest was just heat, just loneliness, just a phase. But I knew better. I knew that this was no longer about solitude interrupted or routine disrupted. This was something else. Something raw, unnamed, and dangerously close to becoming real. And I didn't know how much longer silence would be enough to contain it. The day was warmer than usual, a dense, suffocating kind of heat that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the house. Even with the windows open, the air felt still, unmoving, like the world had paused just long enough for me to notice. The hours passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. I tried to distract myself with chores, laundry, dishes, organizing drawers I hadn't opened in years, but my thoughts drifted constantly. I kept returning to him. To the space we shared, the silence between us, the unspoken awareness that had taken root and refused to loosen its grip. I saw him in fleeting moments that afternoon, passing through rooms without speaking, always just ahead or just behind, never close enough to touch, but never far enough to forget. The distance we had carefully maintained was beginning to shift again, not in dramatic movements but in subtler ways, his pauses in the doorway, the way he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, the sound of his footsteps lingering just outside the room I was in. It felt like something was building, not loud, not obvious, but steady, inevitable. The sun had already started its descent by the time I stepped out onto the porch, hoping the open air might ease the pressure inside my chest. He was already there, sitting on the steps, back to me, his posture relaxed, arms draped over his knees. I stood behind him for a moment, watching the light stretch across the yard, golden and low, touching the edges of everything. Then, without a word, I sat down beside him. Not close, but not far. Just enough to feel the warmth of his body without making contact. We didn't speak. We didn't move. We just sat there in the thick quiet, the kind that feels like a held breath. The light shifted slowly, shadows stretching and fading, until all that remained was the dim hum of the evening. He leaned back on his hands, and his knee brushed mine, lightly, casually, but not by accident. I didn't pull away. I didn't even flinch. The contact was small, unassuming, but it sent a ripple through me so strong I had to focus on my breathing just to stay still. Time slowed after that. Every second felt suspended, waiting. He turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see the edge of his profile. His eyes didn't meet mine, but his presence was fully focused, palpable. He shifted again, leaning in, and I didn't stop him. I didn't question the intent. There was no calculation left in me, no resistance. My thoughts had long since been replaced by sensation, by heat, by awareness, by a quiet, trembling anticipation I could no longer disguise. When his hand settled beside mine on the step, his pinky barely grazing my knuckle, I exhaled, a slow release of something I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension dissolved, not completely, not suddenly, but just enough to let something else rise in its place. I turned toward him slightly, just enough to close the space between us, just enough to acknowledge what had already begun. There was no dramatic gesture, no sudden movement. When our arms touched again, we didn't move apart. When his shoulder leaned against mine, I let it stay there. And when his hand slowly turned to brush against the back of mine, I didn't resist. I felt everything in that simple touch, the careful pressure, the hesitation, the quiet permission. I responded without words, my fingers curling slowly against his, meeting him in the middle of that silent, breathless space. In that moment, I wasn't thinking of consequences. I wasn't thinking of what it meant. I wasn't thinking at all. I was feeling the warmth of his skin, the tension in his hand, the nearness of his breath. We sat like that for what felt like hours, barely moving, barely breathing. It was more intimate than anything we had shared before, not because of the contact itself, but because we had allowed it to happen without interruption, without retreat. When he turned his face slightly, our eyes finally met. It was brief, but full of everything we hadn't said. There was no fear in his expression. Only certainty. And I realized in that instant that I had crossed a line long before I ever touched him. It wasn't this moment that changed things. It was the hundreds of small ones that led to it, the glances, the silences, the proximity we had stopped pretending to manage. This was only the point of no return. Later, inside the house, the lights remained off. The shadows felt softer now, as if they'd given us permission. He passed me in the hallway, and our arms brushed again. Neither of us looked back. Neither of us needed to. The silence between us was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. I went to bed with the memory of his touch still fresh against my skin. I lay in the dark, replaying the weight of the moment over and over again. Not out of regret, but out of disbelief. Out of awe at how something so quiet could be so powerful. I didn't sleep much. I didn't need to. My body was still humming with something new, something fragile, something irrevocable. In the darkness, I accepted what I could no longer deny. I had stepped over the threshold willingly. Not in weakness. Not in confusion. But in clarity. The line had always been there, drawn carefully in silence and shadows, but now it was behind me. And the space I had entered, whatever it was, felt more honest than anything I had known in years. The morning light came in quietly, soft and diffused, casting a pale golden hue across the floorboards. Everything looked unchanged on the surface, the same furniture, the same unopened books, the same muted rhythm of the house, but the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy kind that pressed down with questions and restraint. It wasn't anxious or filled with avoidance. It was simply full, no longer hollow. It had been transformed, shaped by what had passed between us, by what we had finally allowed to happen. I sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm cup, watching the way the steam curled up into the air and disappeared, the same way my thoughts drifted now without resistance. The house felt awake in a new way. Every creak of the floor, every sound from upstairs, carried with it an awareness I could no longer deny. I wasn't just noticing him anymore. I was connected to him. The distance that had once defined our every interaction had collapsed, not suddenly, not violently, but like a wall slowly crumbling under its own weight. It hadn't been broken. It had simply ceased to serve its purpose. When he entered the kitchen later, everything was quiet, but it wasn't the strained quiet of before. It was a shared space now, filled with the aftermath of understanding. He moved easily, unhurried, like someone who had nothing to prove. I watched him from the same chair I had sat in 100 times before, but now every detail struck deeper, the way he opened the refrigerator, the way the light fell across his neck, the way he moved through the room as though he belonged. And maybe he did. Maybe he always had. He poured himself a drink, and for a moment, our eyes met, not with tension, not with hesitation, but with the unspoken acknowledgement of something real. There was no need to fill the air with explanation. What had happened didn't need to be named. It had already rooted itself in the way we moved around each other, in the way we noticed each other, in the way silence no longer demanded escape. I took a sip from my cup, and he leaned back against the counter, and we simply existed like that for a while. The stillness between us wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied, claimed, understood. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A walk through the backyard. A shared glance in the hallway. An accidental brush of shoulders that neither of us pulled away from. Everything remained unspoken, but everything had changed. I kept thinking of that moment on the porch, the quiet closeness, the shift that had tipped everything off balance and yet made everything feel right. Not perfect, not simple, but honest in a way that silence had never been before. That evening, I found myself alone in the living room. The sky outside had turned a deep orange, and the room was bathed in warm shadows. The window was open, letting in the scent of grass and the soft chirping of insects. I sat still, letting the quiet settle over me like a blanket, not to smother me, but to remind me that the time for denial had passed. There was nothing left to hide behind. The line had been crossed, the walls had come down, and now the question wasn't if it had happened, but what it meant. I thought about the inevitability of it all, how it hadn't begun with a single moment, but with a slow accumulation of shared space, of half-held glances, of unvoiced curiosity. The silence we had shared hadn't just been avoidance. It had been language. It had been the shape of something waiting to take form. And now it had. Later that night, I stood in the hallway between our rooms. The doors were closed, but the air was thick with awareness. I could feel him on the other side, could sense his presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. I just stood there, breathing in the stillness, letting the weight of the past few days settle into my chest. My body remembered every moment, the touch, the heat, the breath between us, and I no longer tried to push it away. I returned to my room and lay in the dark, the ceiling above me barely visible in the faint moonlight. I listened to the quiet of the house, not seeking comfort, but listening as though it were a familiar song. I thought about what came next, about the path we had stepped onto without realizing, or maybe fully realizing and still choosing it anyway. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew the silence we had lived in wouldn't protect us anymore. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might come. Because the silence had ended. And in its place was something fragile, something complicated, something undeniable. It didn't need words to exist. It didn't need promises or declarations. It was in the way I felt when he walked into the room. It was in the way I breathed differently when he was near. It was in the way our eyes met and said more than any sentence ever could. I closed my eyes, letting that truth settle. Letting it live. Not fighting it. Not fearing it. The silence had always been a shield, but now, in its absence, I felt exposed and real in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. What came after would be different. It would demand choices. It would require courage. But at least now, I could meet it without pretending. The line had been crossed. The silence had broken. And somewhere in that quiet rupture, I had begun to hear myself again.